Hello. It's great to be here with so many friends on a beautiful DC day. If you wait 2 weeks, DC will be horrible yet again, the weather at least. Also great to be here with so many friends and unfortunately for some of them, co-investors as well. When you talk about the investment landscape in dual-use, innovative, venture-backed, fill in the blank technologies, the challenge I often have, and maybe you do as well, is what the heck does that mean? What does it mean to invest in dual use? What does it mean to successfully invest in dual use? And what is a successful company that may or may not have commercial applications, but certainly has national security relevance and supports our country and the countries of our allies as well? That's the panel that we're here to talk about today. We have Katherine Boyle from Andreessen Horowitz. We have Bilal Zuberi from Lux Capital. We have Nick Sinai, fresh off the plane from Insight. And of course, Peter Dixon from Second Front. What I thought I'd do is briefly share a couple of statistics and then direct a few questions to our panel, do a little Q&A, and certainly get audience participation as well. So here's a couple current statistics I'd like to run by you. In the last 5 years, Small Business Innovative Research Grants, or SBIRs, have grown 10% year on year on year on year on year to $17.5 billion in sum. It's a lot of money. It's also gone to many companies as well. Venture investment over the last 5 years in dual-use technology companies has grown from $5 billion to $15 billion. Not a inconsequential sum of money. And meanwhile, the aforementioned SBIRs, which I think and I hope most of you understand is a key gateway into the Department of Defense business, only 58% have made the leap from phase one, which is a relatively small amount of money, to phase two, which is a modest amount of money. So why does all this matter to you? And then I'll turn it over to our panelists. I think why this matters is when you talk about companies that are going to have government traction, ultimately they have to actually get in the hands of the proverbial warfighter, the person who's actually supposed to be using this as part of their day job, and that means not in a lab or not in a testing range. Ideally, like current operations in Ukraine, being used by people actually doing their real job, deploying and executing and supporting American national security. So I think the focus of this panel, and I think what would be great for all of you to take away from this panel, is to actually get a good understanding of what do those companies look like and what really needs to happen, especially from venture capitalists investing a significant amount of money in those companies to ensure that they actually continue to stay in DoD and ultimately end up in the hands of the warfighter. So maybe I'll first turn to Katherine. Katherine, you've written a lot on this around American dynamism and more recently on, I think, concerns around companies that have gotten significant amounts of investment actually remaining and staying viable in the defense ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what concerns you, especially with the amount of money flowing into companies in the defense space currently?
Yeah, so I think the stats that you talked about earlier are really something we should be optimistic about. I know when I started talking about defense even in 2015, 2016, if you were excited about it in Silicon Valley as an investor, people would laugh you out of the room. It's like, why would you ever want to invest in companies that are selling to government? It's too hard. There's all these other things, apps and all sorts of consumer things you can invest in. Why would you ever invest in defense? And I think what we're seeing now is just a complete sea change that's actually supported by the numbers that you shared, that Silicon Valley, and I'm talking about Silicon Valley as sort of an idea, a type of company building, not a place in Northern California. But there's a real patriotism that exists now and a real excitement of working with the government that did not exist a few years ago. And so we should really take advantage of that. There's very young, talented engineers coming out of the best engineering schools in the country who want to work on these hard problems. Now you mentioned something that I also think bears noting as we begin this conversation, which is that dual-use technology is important. And I think all of us in this room agree that that's important important, but I think that also came from a meme, a pre-existing meme, that the best technologists actually don't want to work on government companies. And so we have to sell dual-use technologies to them because they have to create something commercial, and then maybe when they have enough capital, they can create a federal practice, and therefore they will then work with the government. And so the other thing that has shifted in Silicon Valley that's very important is now there are young engineers, people spinning off of Stanford and Cornell and saying, hey, we actually want to work directly with government, and we want that to be our main priority at seed through Series B. And so that's another thing that I think has truly shifted, is that there's just so much investor excitement, engineering excitement of wanting to work with the DoD. The thing that I've been talking about is that this excitement is a great thing. We've seen billions of dollars, even in the last year alone, going to companies that see the Defense Department as their #1 customer. And if we don't see real production contracts going to these companies, I think that some of the engineering excitement and some of the investor excitement is going to dry up in the next few years. And that's not just me as an investor talking, that's what I'm hearing from people within the department, that's what I'm hearing from founders, that there's sort of this, if we're only getting SIBRs, if we're only getting OTAs, there's a real problem. So I think that's something would all be mindful of, and maybe we can talk about that as well. But the takeaway is that there is just tremendous excitement to solve the most critical needs of the warfighter, whether that is selling direct or as a dual-use company. But the young talent coming into startups these days is very excited about this mission.
That's great. Bilal, you came to this country, went to MIT, I believe, right? You're an actual engineer, and you've had a successful run at Lux Capital, investing in many companies that were dual use even before the term dual use was fashionable. From your perspective, what would you like to see more of in companies that come into this space from a transition perspective, from an investment perspective, and also from a talent perspective?
So first and foremost, I think people here should understand that venture capitalists invest in missionary founders. They're not just investing in money-making machines. Missionary founders end up building great businesses that also end up generating a lot of financial returns. But the mission comes first. And I think part of the entrepreneur ecosystem is driven by the mission to protect the freedoms that we all cherish. They're driven by the idea that United States as a country needs to be defended. Our warfighter should have the best technologies, and that allows us to have the economic superiority and promoting our national interests globally. So that drives founders, and that drives them to build companies that will last generations. That drives people to build companies, whether it's the Palantirs or the Teslas or the SpaceXs, and I don't want to just name companies that Elon Musk might be involved with. But certainly Andurils of the world and Applied Intuitions of the world and Second Fronts of the world and Shield AI of the world. I can go on and on. There's a lot of companies that are being built by these founders that are technologists. The idea of a dual use emerges from, obviously, generally that they have commercial applications as well as defense and government applications. But I think it has a lot more relevance today, not only because, I think Katherine mentioned that, there are people who want to build only for the government, and they absolutely should. But I think there's also this realization that a lot of technology gets developed for the commercial sector, frankly, faster, better, cheaper than for the military sector. 30, 40 years ago, technology used to be developed for the Defense Department first. They would get first access to it. Internet was developed for the Defense Department. Then it would get to the enterprises when it got a little bit cheaper. And the consumers would be the last ones to get access to this technology. That completely shifted, right? So we all had powerful supercomputers in our pockets before we could use it for our work, right? We had iPhones before it could be allowed us at work, and it was like, okay, you can bring your own device to work, and that came later. And military generals, 4-star generals, got access to it 6-7 years after iPhone had been invented, right? And that's happening consistently again and again, where technologies are getting developed for commercial sector, not because they're being developed for the defense purposes, but whether it's machine learning or AI or NLP or automation or autonomy, because they need to be developed there. Applied Intuitions technologies for automotive sector, for example, are extremely complex, extremely sophisticated, but they're equally applicable to the defense sector as well. And I think the idea is, how do we make sure that those technologies become accessible? I always state that our adversaries have actually figured this out before we have. So when we think about China, by law, if you're a company operating and you have any technology that can be used for national security, you're bound to provide it to the government. That is not the case here. We're a voluntary service, unless we have some kind of an emergency order. Entrepreneurs have to choose to work with the government. And I think we want to promote that. I think venture capitalists want to promote that. We think this is a very large market. We think this is a very secular market, right? We also think that this is a space that if we start selling, we can have fast iterating technologies available, we will see greater demand, but we'll also see greater demand for more technology development, faster pace of innovation, which I think drives venture capital.
Brilliant. Yeah. So it just dawned on me, we have an incredible span of experience from journalism to science to Nick being an extremely senior bureaucrat or technocrat, might be the more appropriate term, and of course Pete being a military officer. Nick, from your experience, you operated at the highest levels of the U.S. government in the White House. You've also seen directly from that experience, as well as at Insight, making a significant number of investments. The challenge of, getting in contracts, getting traction in the U.S. government, and then scaling that traction, getting things like authority to operate, dealing with foci mitigation and proxy boards and the minutia of what it takes to actually grow a successful enterprise. Can you talk more about your experience with companies that have successfully done that, as well as the companies that tend not to fully understand that, and maybe share why do you think that is?
Yeah, I guess I would say that there's really two challenges for both dual use and defense companies, but also for more traditional cybersecurity companies or commercial software as a service companies that are trying to enter the public sector. So one is this lack of operational buying, and I think it's something we should continue to talk about. That is, how do we get the program executive offices to really lean in? But this other piece is this, what I call bureaucratic cruft, and it's a series of practices, and it could be the authority to operate, so how you get software to go live. It could be the foreign influence, the foci, and it could be ITAR, state licensing. And all of these are well-intentioned processes, but they also tend to be paper-based. They tend to be kind of committee-based. They tend to take a long time. And when you add it up, you just have this kind of bureaucratic cruft that is a tax for companies entering the public sector. And so the conventional wisdom for venture capitalists, both at the early and the growth stage, was it helps to have some scale before you enter federal, because you're going to have to go get FedRAMP, or you're going to have to go through all of these kind of bureaucratic processes, and they're going to cost money and time. And so that's a thing that you might want to wait until you're a little bit larger as a traditional software company. If you are defense or dual use at your DNA, if that's kind of in your mission, you're not going to wait for a few years to do that. You actually have to have bureaucracy hacking as one of your core competencies. And so that's part of the function that all the companies that we invest in, and it's something that Peter does really well, which is how do we accelerate entry? And the large primes, they do this really well. They have armies of people that do all of these kinds of things, and we're not going to have 100 people in any one portfolio company attacking these dozen processes.
One thing that I'll point to you, because we had this conversation a few weeks ago at another meeting. The number one SBIR you mentioned earlier, small business. Startups are not small businesses. At some point in their life, they qualify as small businesses. But I often say they're genetically engineered to scale. Right? If they stay as small businesses, they're a failure. Certainly from a venture capital-backed startup perspective. Mm-hmm. So the whole SBIR process, it's such a small amount of money, relatively speaking, and somehow we've thought that that's enough for us to find innovation and bring that into the department. It doesn't work. You have to find other pools of capital. Go figure out how to do that, right? We are at war, whether we like it or not, and it's a hyper war. Requires automation and autonomy and AI, and we have to find where that technology is and figure out how to buy it. But the second thing, Nick, you brought it up at earlier in a meeting with me that the way the process works in Department of Defense is this requirements stuff, right? So to 2 years or maybe even longer before the money ever gets allocated, you write a requirements doc. And primes are like set up generally to be able to do that. They work the Defense Department for many, many years, sometimes decades, to figure out how to write the requirements such that pretty much they're the only ones who qualify for that, right? And then you go through and just make the product. So in some ways, you have to choose your supplier before you even know what they can build for you. Startups don't work like that. Startups build products because venture capitalists give them money to develop the technology and turn it into a product. What we're really looking for is a customer to buy the product. And I think this is what Katherine talks about a lot, is that we need buyers of product. We're not looking for grants. Startups are not looking for small amounts of money that are development and research contracts. They're looking for customer on the other side, any number of offices within any number of government agencies, national security agencies, Department of Defense, and so on. That has to come, and that has to show scale. And if that happens, there is a tremendous amount of venture capital that is ready to go into these companies. There are venture-backed companies that we have invested in that have raised over $1 billion each. Right? Applied Intuition has raised a lot of money. These are all companies that are very well funded because they can find customers on the other side. And I think we have to figure out how to make that transition so that it doesn't stay in the R&D phase.
Yeah, so let me just add on that in terms of R&D, because I know VCs are often telling companies, look, don't bother with cyber, and I actually disagree with that pretty strongly. I think especially as we look at the current climate, that cyber money is going to be really important. I would just tell any company that is hoping to raise venture capital, just don't pretend to the VCs that it's revenue, because it's not. It's
NRE.
Say what?
NRE.
NRE. It's non-dilutive, non-recurring engineering. And as long as you list it accordingly, you're going to be fine. But what it does give you is it does give you sole source justification, right, to be able to get to a phase 3. The problem with CBIRs and other transactions and everything else is that it often ends up being innovation theater, often a petting zoo, where it's not incorporated into operational data flows, or you don't have a chance to make it indispensable to the user, so they don't feel like they need it. It's often a petting zoo that they may take a look at and think it's compelling, but they're not really going to say, this is technology I can't live without. And so what I realized in the Marine Corps was that the technology that I'd seen at places like In-Q-Tel and DARPA during my time in the Pentagon was not getting into the hands of my lance corporals in harm's way. And that was amazingly frustrating, to be spending, as much as the 10 next countries combined. Yet, in Afghanistan, we were effectively on a level playing field with the Taliban, right? They had IEDs, we had airstrikes. And that stung. That was not what I expected. And so when I got out of that experience, I really tried to figure out what was causing this. And we call ourselves national security professionals. We talk about the valley of death. Have you ever heard somebody actually define what the valley of death is? How can we call ourselves national security professionals unless we actually dig into that? So we did in part, and I know you have as well. And really, to my mind, there are two big things there that you need. One, you need a production contract to be able to succeed, or access to it. And then you need the ability to have an authority to operate, to go into production. And we realized that problem was taking a year and a half, costing companies in internal and external costs and consultants and everything else $1 million to $2 million, right? Sometimes if they were lucky. And then once you broke in, there were other security enclaves that you then weren't allowed into. So you weren't even into the full market yet. And so a second front, we built a platform to be able to pull companies, containerized software, through that process in as little as 70 days, which is the longest it's taken us so far, and to be able to do updates in 24 to 48 hours. The reason that's a big deal is, for instance, when you change an AI framework, the military says, okay, well, now you've changed the framework, so it's now out of compliance. So even though you as a startup, busted your ass and all of your engineers worked a weekend to be able to create something that was going to save lives in Ukraine, even with a general pounding the table, we can't field it, right? We can't, from a compliance perspective, we can't field it for another 2 months, right? And by that time, it's obsolete. So that's really the problem that we specifically are solving. Before I put down the mic, let me just, for the benefit of everybody, let me just understand who the audience is here. So if you're government, can you raise your hand? Okay. If you work in what you would describe as, a defense company, either a small business or a traditional defense company, can you raise your hand? Okay. If you're part of a startup, can you raise your hand? Great. That's a big group on the startup side. Okay, great. Thank you.
So since you jumped the mic, I was going to I had a couple of Marine jokes, but I'll make sure to kind of sprinkle them around.
I was going to say, you have all smart VCs here and me as a Marine. Are you sure I'm on the right panel here?
No, well, it's interesting that, the joke was that Pete was the guy responsible for the Marines giving up all their tanks. And the other joke, I'll just go with it, was who has more tanks than the U.S. Marines currently? Ukrainian farmers. So there's more where that came from. Real quick, audience participation. Ask Nexus 22. Hopefully you've been paying attention. Ask Nexus 22 at Gmail. That's the email to send your questions to us. And let me stay with Pete, though. I think your inclusion here is important because you've actually had to go raise money and make a value prop that people will buy, right, in the form of venture dollars at an attractive valuation. Key point, if you ever raise money, unless I'm giving you money. In that case, I'm happy to crush you on valuation. What was the argument that you made to your investors, like Artis and Kleiner, on why they should invest in you? What the value was, what the value was to the market, or like product market fit, and then also what the product mission fit was, right? How is this going to solve the actual problems that you were just talking about?
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer this question without bagging on sort of the traditional defense industry and DoD a little bit, which I swore I wasn't going to do up here on stage because I feel that that's what these sessions turn into. But let me just put some numbers out there to put this in kind of stark terms. So the average tech transition, how long it takes the traditional defense industrial base to produce software for the Pentagon, so for IT, is 105 months from RFI to initial fielding. So that's catastrophic failure by any standard. So in terms of like the new positions that are being announced and everything else, I tend to be optimistic about that stuff, but really some of this seems like shuffling deck chairs a little bit. When you look at almost 9 years to field technology, I mean, that says a process doesn't need to be reformed. That a process needs to be done away with. And so what we were able to say is, given that level of failure, this is a space that is ripe for disruption by commercial technology that can come in, if we can remove the barrier for them to be able to do so. And so we had a value proposition that we could do that, and so that we could see a shift in hundreds of billions of dollars moving from traditional defense companies that were failing the American warfighter, flat out failing, to dual-use commercial companies, because something like 18 out of 20 different lines of effort of what DoD actually needs, from AI/ML to robotics to adaptive launch, is all coming from the commercial sector. And until the traditional defense companies figure out how to incentivize and retain good software engineers, they will not be able to compete on anything that has dual-use applicability.
Brilliant. Katherine, I'll direct this question towards you, but if any of the other panelists want to chime in, please do. Yesterday in a session, Peter Ludwig, one of the senior leaders at Applied Intuition, mentioned something that really caught my attention. He said that the self-driving or autonomous driving, car or ecosystem has actually been driving a lot of secondary investment in related technologies, to include what Applied Intuition is quite good at. I thought that was very, very interesting, because I'm old enough to remember 7 years ago, when the third offset strategy was like coming out, that there was this whole discussion around, the DoD and drives innovation, and then the commercial industry has always played catch up, which was in many cases very, very true. So when he said that, I said, wow, like maybe this is a paradigm shift. And there's a line of thinking along with that paradigm shift that I know other VCs have publicly talked about is maybe we're just spending too much money, the silver money especially, on too many companies, right? So we should keep spending the same amount of money, but we should be picking, in essence, kind of national tech champions, if you will, analogous to what the Chinese do with their, I think, 8 companies they pick. Any thoughts on the idea around, and it's really kind of an American dynamism,
Totally.
industrial policy question, isn't it?
No, I actually love that point because I think that's one of the things that we're always surprised as venture capitalists what companies work out coming out of movements. I mean, autonomous vehicles was 5 years ago the place where so much capital. 2023 was the year we were going to see autonomous vehicles on the street of New York City and Washington D.C. That was going to be fantastic. And what we've seen is actually sensor technology, LiDAR technology coming down the cost curve to the point where any defense company can benefit from that investment, from commercial investment. So I think the kind of moral of that story is that the DoD, it would be wrong for the DoD not to benefit for the mistakes of investors. I shouldn't call it mistakes, but for the visions of what's going to happen in the next 10 years, because so much of that investment is actually very commercially applicable to what the DoD does. Not only from from a commercial context, but from a government context. So I think that's really important and something that we should remember. And I also love this idea that I think a lot of going back to there's just a lot of memes that are so dated. The idea that the government is only going to be the only funders of science in this country, and that that we don't have enough research dollars, and that's where technology is coming from. The 5 years in Silicon Valley land is 50 years compared to anything else. The acceleration that we are seeing is so extraordinary, and so I think some of the kind of dated memes about how you build a company, about how software works, about how we bring new technology into the DoD, they go stale just because of the pace of technology and things that even investors and founders up here can never picture happening. So I think we have to keep that in mind, that just the pace of technology and pace of especially of commercial technology innovation is leading us to where every industry has to be kind of on their toes of how do we adapt to this pace and acceleration.
I actually want to add something to that. So in the previous generation, there was these cell phones that came out, right? Like all of us have one in our pocket. And if you don't, why not? But out of that came a series of technologies that became very ubiquitous. GPS prices went, remember we used to buy GPS systems at Sears and Best Buy for $300 independently, and now it's, $1, right? GPS sensors are $1.
If you find a Sears, it's probably still $300 on the shelf.
It's true. But that was the peace dividend of the cell phone wars. A whole bunch of clocking devices and sensors and all of that stuff became really cheap and became ubiquitous in every device that we use now. There's similarly going to be what's been called the peace dividend of the autonomous car wars. There's going to be a series of technologies that are going to come out that are going to be very valuable across a lot of different sectors. 8-9 years ago, nobody believed, besides a few, hardcore believers, in electric cars being the dominant mode of transportation, right? People joked around that Tesla is basically existent because it's a taxpayer subsidy company. Right? Now we have autonomous cars driving around in the streets and testing, in at least 4 or 5 different cities, fully autonomous as taxi cars. And out of that is going to be, the LiDAR systems, the compute systems that are coming out, and simulation systems that are coming out that are now becoming applicable for many other industries. Innovation does not happen linearly. This whole idea of writing requirements because we know what the future will look like, what will our conflict with China look like 5 years out, is absolute utter nonsense. It's batshit bullshit, right? It just doesn't work. We have no idea what that conflict's going to look like. So we have to be on a technology development pathway that allows us to innovate and move really quickly and also, serendipitously. I'll give you a quick example, and I hope it doesn't take too much time, right? VCs do not know what the future is going to look like. Like VCs, I have no idea what the future investment is going to look like, where I'm going to deploy the $1 billion that I may have raised last year, right? But what I do know is going to be at the cutting edge of what we're already investing in. About 9-10 years ago, we became interested in this area of science called metamaterials for cloaking devices. Yes, you can cloak, our planes with that material science technology. We ended up investing along with Bill Gates into that for solid state antenna, radar antennas. That company is now selling to special operations forces. Right? And it's also selling to commercial companies. Those guys sitting in a board meeting said, hey, you should look at this company coming out of NASA. It's like a bunch of kids who are building satellites the size of a shoebox. And I'm like, what? Satellites are $300 million to build and $350 million to put in space. So you went and see these guys, and they're like building these satellites, which are essentially a lens the size of a shoebox with electronics wrapped around it. And they're like looking for, hyenas in Africa or something. And turns out that company became what was called Cosmogia then became Planet Labs, which we invested in. And Planet has the largest Earth-observing satellite constellation in space that's in operation today. And that satellite imagery is being used by the Ukrainians and for Ukrainian use. Getting that data, we're like, oh my God, there's going to be a ton of data coming down. Who's going to analyze this data? Are we going to have, thousands and thousands of people in building looking at images? Remember when we were all looking for the downed airliner in Malaysia, and you're like, if you find this image and find a part floating around, we're like, how are we going to do this? Well, we said, it's going to be machine learning AI is going to do that. Right? So we invested in a company called Orbital Insight that's doing part of Project Maven and a bunch of other work using machine learning AI to identify images, whether it's over North Korea or Ukraine or whatever. It's all machine learning technologies. They then told us that, hey, we do all of this in the cloud using NVIDIA GPUs. We're like, there's only one company in the world that does that. So that led us to an investment in Nirvana that Intel acquired. Right? Now, if you look at this trajectory that I just said, we're looking at metamaterial, which is really a material science technology, leading us through machine learning, intelligence, satellites, down to semiconductor technologies. That's what happens in venture capital, and this is a story of just 9 years. Right?
So
that's what we need to be investing in.
So I want to continue this, but add a flavor of government policy, which I know gets everyone out of bed in the morning. This question is obviously directed towards Nick. So I think 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote an article on foreign policy saying that America, this is back when the Trump administration was launching their new executive order, right, on industrial policy, a very sexy topic. And I think the article title was something of the effect of America needs a new dreadnought strategy. And the idea behind that was taking a page from our friends across the pond who had imagine being the Royal Engineer that came up in the 1880s with the concept, a viable MVP, if you will, minimum viable product, for the dreadnought, right? Revolutionized naval warfare. And the British High Command said, cool, like, why don't you just sit on that intentionally as a national policy for 25 years? Including, and so Britain went to war multiple times with deliberately inferior technology, at least publicly at the time, as a national policy in terms of deploying or withholding technology. And that wasn't a technology or an investment issue, right? What held them back was an aspect of national policy. So from a national policy perspective, what would you like to see more of in the Biden administration or future administrations when it comes to engaging venture capitalists, engaging technology, and driving that technology, hopefully within an OODA loop that Bilal was talking about, in terms of making sure that you have capability that reflects the reality today and not the reality today, but then somehow projected 50 years in the future?
So there's another conference going on today, Code for America. And the GSA administrator, Robin Carnahan, is famous for saying, just make the goddamn websites work, right? And the domestic policy advisor, Susan Rice, has talked about publicly about policy is great, but you actually have to execute on policy. So I'm a big fan of policy. I spent part of my career as a policy staffer, but policy doesn't amount to a hill of beans if the government can't execute on it. And so, yes, there's a ton of how do you remove the bureaucratic cruft, but it's also how can the Defense Department actually execute on that. I'm also really passionate about talent strategy, and so we have tremendous talent inside of government and tremendous talent that wants to come work in government to solve some of these problems, to help government better find, try, and scale the best technology to meet the diverse mission needs. I'm honored to have helped with the U.S. Digital Corps, which is about early career technical talent in government. There's some great people flow programs about bringing people out of government. And even in Bilal's story, you notice the NASA engineer, all of the defense and dual use companies that we invest in, they have a government engineer, technologist person who has come out and is determined to do things better. And so I think government policies that focus on, how do we continue to attract and keep great talent and continue to upskill great talent are going to help address some of these challenges.
Brilliant. Peter, can you in your remarks also flavor in the primes? We talked about them a little bit, and we are definitely going to talk about the war for talent. But I think the consensus is that if you're a venture-backed technology company, primes are very, very necessary up to a point. Obviously, you came out of the defense industry, and of course, of Second Front. What are your views on that? And then maybe once you go, happy to have the rest of you guys chime in as well, because I think this is an important point. And I talked with an unnamed Secretary of Defense who was involved in the third offset strategy, which should narrow it down to two. And they said, this individual said a year or two after it launched, they said, you know what? I think we inadvertently alienated the defense industrial base in the initial rollout of the third offset strategy. So would love to get your comments on any and all of that, especially as how all of our companies relate to the primes.
Yeah, I like your example of the Dreadnought, right? So the reason the British sat on that was because they had the best fleet in the world. And what the Dreadnought did was it reset the playing field. And so why would they reset the playing field when they were ahead and when the Dreadnought was coming out of their defense industrial base? The problem is that now it's not like we have isolated defense industrial bases that are driving military technological advantage. Where it's being driven from is from a global technological pool of companies that we have our sphere of influence. The CCP, like what's being talked about earlier, has their sphere of influence, but we all have access to it. And so, if we don't adopt, for instance, AI, it's not like we can sit on that and not reset the playing field. The playing field's being reset. It's just a question of, are we picking it up or are we not? And so let me just be real here for a little bit. A bunch of us are aware of what's going on in terms of, say, like the AI effort within DoD. And when we heard the list of organizations that were going over to this new executive, I didn't hear Maven mentioned. It's going over to NGA. What I am being told by people that feel like they know is that NGA is already messaging that they don't have the budget they have 10% of the budget necessary to maintain Maven. So this is the most effective thing that DoD has done in AI, right? And it's already being messaged that it's going to be carved up by the bureaucracy. That terrifies me. You have Mike Brown, who's going to be on a panel later, coming out publicly. And this is a deeply, deeply humble man who keeps his head down and does the work. He is not a showboat. And he is saying benign neglect is killing DIU. I think we're at a real inflection point where a bunch of different efforts have made a phenomenal start. But we have to decide as a national security community, are we going to go back to business as usual, which, as I mentioned, is catastrophic levels of failure? Or are we going to actually be serious about the start that we've made here on the 3 programs that have worked? 3 out of 160 different buying centers that have innovation in their name in DoD. There are 3 that work. It's AFWorks for the Air Force that recaptured the SBIR budget from basically what was largely SBIR mills. It's Defense Innovation Unit for the DoD, and it's InQtel for the CIA and intelligence community. That's it. Everything else may have had great people who did phenomenal things, but they were never given the budget authorities or resources necessary to actually move the needle. So that's what I'd say in terms of my view on the traditional defense industrial base. Honestly, we do need a national security innovation base in this country, and something that looks a hell of a lot more like Israel than what we have today, because what we have today just flat out isn't working.
Anyone else?
I'd love to go back to the talent point, because I think it ties into this nicely. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I've gone back and looked at Paul Volcker in 1989 led a commission called A Quiet Crisis, was the name of the paper he put out about the talent crisis facing the federal bureaucracy. It's 1989. We've been talking about this for a very long time. I think if you're actually going to talk about the moment that things really switched in America, I've talked about this a lot. I think it was with the revocation of the draft in 1973, where we told our young people that they no longer have to serve their country. It's totally fine if they want to go to a great university and go into the private sector. And I'd say the good thing that's happened and that's changed since the 80s is a lot of our best and brightest used to go to great universities, and they used to go out and they used to go work for consulting firms. They used to go to Wall Street. They used to serve themselves in a way that they thought was best for themselves and their family, and ignore public service altogether. And I think what Silicon Valley has changed is that serving your country through a government company, like SpaceX, like Applied Intuition, like Palantir, like Anduril, these companies are so cool. I know that Elon Musk is sometimes seen as a polarizing figure, but he has made space cool again. He has made government cool again. And the number of companies that have learned that playbook of how you work with government, but how you also do hardcore engineering in the private sector, it is the trifecta that has come together that is really going to benefit this country. And we have a whole generation of young people that look at these companies and say, this is what I want to do with the next 10, 20 years of my life. And so we can't say, oh, well, how are we going to bring them into government? How are we going to change what they want to do? I think we have to meet them where they are, which is wanting to work in these really fast-paced startups, whether they're working as a founder or whether they're working at these companies. So I'm less optimistic about solving the talent crisis, that something is dramatically going to shift, where young people are going to say, government is wonderful. You just turn on the news. I don't think that anyone's looking at government and saying, wow, that's where I want to spend my time right now. So I think we have to be realistic about that and somewhat stoic about that. But ultimately, there's this entire just talent network that wants to serve. And so we have to capitalize on it, and we have to do it in the next few years.
Bilal, I know you have thoughts on this.
I want to just second what Peter was saying, not second front him. But this is a moment of crisis, and I think part of the problem is that we're in this weird situation where, on one hand, we have our politicians telling the world that we just pulled out of the war in Afghanistan and we don't want to put troops anywhere. The reality is that we are at war. We just don't want to accept it. We're at war because we have. Just because we don't have troops engaged in the battlefield directly in geography, that does not mean we're not at war. We are fighting China every single day. There are, massive, all of us must have heard by now that semiconductor manufacturing is basically done either in China or in Taiwan. Every IoT device you have, every camera you have for your home security or whatever, has chips that were built in China and probably already programmed to be activated whenever necessary. We know that because we fund in cybersecurity companies that try to protect at least industries that can pay. Likely they're not working for your camera that's situated at home, right? We have China-made drones that have taken high-resolution imagery of almost every sensitive site everywhere in the name of infrastructure management, right? DJI, it's turned out to be very closely related to the Chinese government. It is the only drone company, pretty much, at scale, until just a few years ago when the US DoD decided that we're not going to buy it. But for years, they had full freedom to do whatever they wanted to do in this country. We have, we are at war with Russia. We may not want to have our fingerprints on it, but we are at war with Russia, right? We are at war with terrorists still all around the world. Iran and North Korea are not that far behind, and we just have to know, what are we going to do about this? Right? Like, when this war is at our doorstep, that'll be too late to act on it. And unfortunately, that thinking, and again, going back to Nick told me this example where somebody came up to him from the DoD and said, how much money do you spend on enterprise software investments? And he said, a few $1 billion a year. He said, why do you do that? Why don't you just write the requirements and give it to a prime and they'll build the software for you? Like, that entire understanding of this poor guy who worked for one of the primes was that all you have to do is give me the requirements and I can go build it. That is not how innovation works.
That's assuming they know what the requirements are.
Correct. There's no way of knowing. No VC could sit and tell you what needs to happen. Even Steve Jobs, who built the iPhone, could not have told you that I'm building this iPhone so that you can, the biggest app built on it is going to be for you to call cabs. Right? Like, that's not why he built the iPhone, or to take photos that disappear. Innovation happens because innovation happens. Right? We have drones, ocean-going drones that are all around the world that are collecting data right now for support of US military, but also for navigation around the oceans for commercial purposes. Right? This is technology advantage that we've got now. How do we make sure we actually use that? This is, I think, as Peter was saying, we have to get serious about this. If we don't get serious about this, and we all think of this as a giant $750 billion DoD budget as basically an entitlement program, it's just job creation in 50 states, then let's find money elsewhere to invest in actual startups and actual technology that we need so our war fighters are actually safe and actually we're able to win wars. I mean, at the end of the day, if we're going to go to war, we better win it.
And I think we're collectively responsible, right? So I testified in front of Congress a few years ago pretty negatively about the primes and said, like, look, I don't blame the primes. We created this system, and it served us very well. And I have some really good friends and talented public servants and military officers who work in the primes, right? And a lot of our portfolio companies will sell to and through the primes. And some of them are just crazy enough to try and replicate a prime. We're investors in rebellion defense, right? Like Andreessen, for example, crazy enough to try and be a prime. But most venture-backed companies are going to be selling to and through. But we have to create that kind of pressure on the defense industrial base that they need to partner. They need to find ways to incorporate technology that changes rapidly. And to Bilal's point is we can't be writing requirements for years, procuring for years, building for years, and then give it to a warfighter. Because technology will have changed, the user need may have changed. I mean, we saw this in Ukraine where there's kind of real-time change in Starlink, right? Where the Russians are attacking the constellation, the communications constellation, and they're changing kind of it in real time, and we need to have that kind of responsive capabilities, and so we can't be thinking about software as these big capital assets, right? Like a battleship. Software is a living, breathing thing, and it continues to evolve, and we can't think about it in terms of capital and then operation and maintenance, which is kind of the way this town does.
Peter, as you respond, feel free to respond to this as well, but I'm going to layer in a couple audience participation questions at the same time that I'd love all of you to respond to with the, I think, 2 or 3 minutes we have left. One is Katherine has described emerging patriotism in the Valley and an increase in the defense cool factor since 2015. Basis I showed back up in D.C. Thank you. Basis I showed back up in D.C. And I guess the question is, what's driving that change of sentiment? And then relatedly, for all of you, what are your priorities or areas of interest? And we're all, for the venture-backed companies in the room, you're already halfway through Q2. So, you're halfway through 2022. What are the kind of priorities that your funds are interested in or focused on for the rest of this year and going into the next year?
Yeah, I think don't run out of money, right, is what most of the startups in terms of priority for the next year. I think that there are storm clouds on the horizon, and so one of the this whole thing about Silicon Valley or startups not wanting to work with DoD. I mean, other than the one Google example, who, by the way, is back working with DoD heavily, including in Maven, right? So it's a total red herring. I have to think perpetuated in part by folks who like the status quo and are invested in the status quo and sort of saying, stay in our cold dead embrace, they don't want you anyway. So I would say a lot of what's being driven practically is, got it, 1 minute left. I'll wrap it here. I'll just say when I first went into working actually for a Silicon Valley startup, like it sounds like many people in the room might be, I was told by some of the VCs who now have invested in us, don't do it because the federal sales guy or gal that works for our startup, if it's the first one, they get fired within the first year 80% of the time. And so I would just say, don't get distracted by all of the different things that are out there and all of the cul-de-sacs and rabbit holes that you can go down. You just need 2 things to be successful. You need to nail your pilot and turn it into a production contract, and you need authority to operate. You do those 2 things, you'll be fine.
Priorities, real quick.
My priority this year is we just launched a new practice that we're referring to as American Dynamism, which is companies that support and actively support the national interest. And this goes back to this newfound patriotism question that came out, which is I genuinely believe we're in this historic moment where young people very much want to serve their country, but they want to do it through building. They see themselves as builders, they see themselves as supporters of the national interest, and most importantly, they've seen success. They've seen SpaceX, they see reusable rockets, they see that it can be done. So we have an extraordinary moment right now to take advantage of it. So our firm is launching this practice. We're actively investing in companies that support government. I think there's many of us on this panel who've been doing that for a very long time. And we want to see every firm have an American Dynamism practice or something like it that actively supports this country.
Bilal?
I think I'll just support what Katherine said. That's the most important thing. And just to the audience and founders, don't own the solutions, own the problems. Like, there are many, many important problems to solve in the world. Use technology to solve those problems.
We just closed a $20 billion fund, so we're definitely open for business. We're passionate about public sector, and we're passionate about software and data-driven innovation.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us. As you can see, it's a rare treat to get a lot of people who invest a significant amount of money in companies that we all care about and actually hear what they all have to say and giving them each a chance to play off of each other as well. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists.